Text, the workshop will begin shortly. Share questions and comments in the chat window on the right side of your screen. Questions will be reviewed during the Q&A period. Closed captioning, bit.ly/3AE_OM7V. Zoom technical support 1-888-799-9666, extension 2, or support.zoom.us/hc/en-us. Feedback, bit.ly/2KSQ N0J. Follow us on Twitter at NIA_SBIR. Monique Laroque appears via webcam.
The webinar will begin shortly. Before we begin, we wanted to review a few housekeeping items. We want this to be an interactive session, so we will accept your questions and comments throughout, and we'll be responding to them during the Q&A period. You can share your questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom. You can also chat us directly. We will provide the slides for this presentation for those who are interested in receiving them, and we will also send you some of the key links that we will be discussing. We are also offering closed captioning for this, as well as Zoom technical support. You can see the links and the number on your screen. We'd like you to join the conversation, and please follow us on Twitter. And most importantly, we want you to take time to learn with us and to engage with us. This is just the start of our conversation, and we welcome the opportunity to meet with you one-on-one. We also welcome your feedback. If you will click the link by the end of the session or midway through and begin to answer some of your opinions and thoughts about how we can improve the session going forward. And with that, we will begin.
Photos of a woman speaking during a meeting around a conference table, and a doctor wearing a cap and mask reaching for a holographic brain scan.
Welcome to the NIA SBIR STTR Virtual Workshop Series. This first workshop is focused on developing a competitive commercialization plan and SBIR Phase 2 application.
A photo of Todd Haim, Ph.D.
I'd like to welcome our featured speaker, Dr. Todd Haim, Chief of the Office of Small Business Research at the National Institute on Aging at NIH.
Photos of Dan Burnett, M.D., M.B.A., and Valerie Humblet, Ph.D.
We're also joined by our guest panelists and awardees, Dr. Dan Burnett, President and CEO of TheraNova, as well as Dr. Valerie Humblet, Head of Research and Development at Collagen Medical, LLC. And I am your facilitator, Monique Laroque. Todd, will you do the honors?
Slide text, NIH SBIR and STTR Programs. SBIR, the program funds early-stage small businesses seeking to commercialize innovative life science technologies and services. STTR, the program is similar to the SBIR program, but requires that the small business formally collaborate with a research institution.
Hello all. First of all, thank you very much for coming. My wife is always surprised when I tell her that 5 or 6 people are actually volunteering to hear me talk, let alone 200, so thank you. We're going to go through really focusing on the Phase 2 proposal, but I'll start with a short overview of how that fits into overall programs. So as I think most of you know, SBIR and STTR, 2 sisters programs. Important to note that when I say SBIR throughout this presentation, I do often mean both SBIR and STTR. Together at NIA, we estimate that the programs will total about $118 to $119 million this year at National Institute on Aging, and close to $1.2 billion at the NIH overall. And most of what I'll say really is general to the NIH SBIR program. Where there are things specific to NIA, I'll highlight those. But for those of you that might have Phase 2s at other institutes, do know that most of the content will very much be relevant to you as well. Next slide.
A bar chart titled NIA SBIR and STTR Obligation shows a steady increase from $27.5 million in 2013 to an estimated $118.7 million in 2020.
So specific to NIA, this shows how our funding, and in large part due to congressional attention to the need for additional funding for Alzheimer's disease research, has dramatically increased, and this looks at just the SBIR part of that, but has dramatically increased over the past 5 to 7 years. And with that increase, we recognize that you're going to manage a $119 million seed stage fund very differently than you would a $32 million fund. Next.
NIA Office of Small Business Research, core activities, central coordination, guidance, outreach, funding, networking, entrepreneurship.
So in recognition of that, the NIA has decided to create an office that's been in existence about 1.5 years. Our office really has 6 key function areas. The first is to centrally coordinate the SBIR programs across the divisions and across the NIA. We have 4 scientific divisions at the NIA, as well as the Division of Extramural Activities, in which the Office of Small Business Research is a part of. We guide applicants. Hopefully many of you have been in touch with us before. Dr. M.D. Currens is a great initial point of contact. If you have questions about your application, all of our other staff are available as well. And when appropriate, there may be questions that will be better for a program officer in one of the divisions, and we can help make that handoff and connect you to the right person. We do outreach. Before the pandemic, we were very active and traveled to different workshops across the country and trying to help companies understand what it takes to get funded and what we're looking for. And now with the pandemic, we really want to take that model and make it virtual. So on that note, I do want to mention that this, and thank you for coming to what is the inaugural virtual education webinar. We do expect this to be a regularly occurring event, and we will be offering different webinars every month or 2 on different topics. So ones that we're thinking about in the future may involve highlighting the CRP and the phase 2B, talking about our diversity supplement, and talking about how peer review works. So each of these topics will be different things that we'll go into in further detail in other webinars. So stay tuned on that. Funding, we are continuing developing new funding opportunities around specific areas. Networking, facilitating connections between our companies and each other and potential strategic partners or NIA programs. And then we've really gotten involved in at the NIH in really more entrepreneurship training, as well as webinars on key commercialization related topics. And there is a new office established at the NIH called Small Business Education and Entrepreneurial Development, SEED. And with that office, we work closely together to make sure that any resources, any support you need as innovators, we can provide as much as possible. Next slide.
SBIR and STTR program phases and funding levels. A table breaks down the following phases: Phase 1, Discovery and Feasibility; Phase 2, Development and full R&D; and 2B, Competing Renewal. Between Phase 2 and 2B are the options: Fast Track, Direct to Phase 2, SBIR Only, and Commercialization Readiness Pilot.
So most of you on the call probably understand that there are several phases, because I know many of you are existing awardees. The first phase we call proof of concept. Now, of course, remember, if anyone that is new, Congress created this phase nomenclature. They weren't thinking about medical research when they did it, so there's no correlation with clinical trial nomenclature. In reality, most of what we fund is in fact preclinical research. But not all, we will fund clinical research. A phase 1 proof of concept, again, usually preclinical, typically up to 1 year. The budgets will depend on the funding opportunity as well as the institute. So for those that are interested in other awards at other institutes, make sure to check what that institute will fund. But for the NIA, if it's through the omnibus, we'll fund up to $300,000. And for our AD/ADRD solicitation for SBIR, we'll fund up to $500,000. Our phase 2, generally up to $2 million. For that AD/ADRD solicitation, up to $2.5 million. Now that's total cost and usually over 2 years, so not per year. And it does require a commercialization plan, which brings us to today's webinar. Now, that commercialization plan is an important piece of the application, and we'll go into that as we go through this session. You can apply for a fast track, which is essentially applying for phase 1 and phase 2 together in one application. You would use the same format and page limits as a phase 2 application. And we now have the opportunity for you to apply to direct to phase 2. In which case, if you already have, through other sources, you've been able to collect data, you have that phase 1 type proof of concept data, then you can come directly in for that phase 2 and use those phase 2 budget limits and come in with a phase 2 approach. This is new for about 1 to 2 years. We've had it. We previously had an older version that expired congressionally, and we've launched it again. We now also have the Commercialization Readiness Pilot Program. This is the CRP, and I'll talk more about this in just a couple minutes. And then also the phase 2B, which is after the phase 2, additional 3 years and up to $3 million. Next.
NIA Funding Opportunities. A table with opportunities for SBIR and STTR listed under columns for omnibus FOAs and AD and ADRD focused FOAs.
So I already mentioned that the vast majority of our applications, and this is really across the NIH, comes in through the omnibus, which is not an NIA solicitation, but rather an NIH solicitation. And there are topics for each institute that provide some ideas of what the mission and the overall topic interests of the institutes are. But in reality, this is an investigator-initiated funding opportunity. You tell us exactly what you're working on, and the right institute that fits that will get assigned. For the NIA, we will allow up to $300,000 for phase 1 and up to $2 million for phase 2. Now, this is for topics that we have an approved waiver, but the reality is for most of what fits within the NIA mission space, we do have waivers approved. So if you are applying to NIA, in all likelihood, you can apply for up to these limits. And you will see different institutes have different levels. I mentioned that we do have almost like an omnibus for Alzheimer's disease. It's a open-ended solicitation to address Alzheimer's disease, whether it be therapeutics, whether it be digital health, research tools. And for that one, we can allow up to $500,000 for phase 1 and up to $2.5 million for phase 2. We also have several other funding opportunities, and these are all listed on our website.
Budget specifics, total cost budgets. SBIR budgets are defined by total cost and subcontracting is limited. Know the rules and criteria. Check budget allowance in each funding opportunity.
So I mentioned that the limits that I'm talking about are all total costs. Now, there are some limits to subcontracting, and this is often, one of the most frequently asked questions in terms of virtual companies. So, for example, in a phase 1, per the rule for SBIR, 2/3 of the work has to be done by the small business, which in NIH is usually interpreted as 2/3 of the budget has to go to the small business. Now, if you are partially virtual and you are sending, let's say you have a new drug and you're sending that out to a CRO for commercially available assay, you're sending them your drug, they're running it through the commercial assay, they're sending you the data, you're doing all the analysis. That's a commercially available service, you're doing the analysis, and they're charging you a fee per basis, meaning no indirect costs. In that case, you're buying a service as one of your supplies, and you can count it under material supplies, and it can count as part of the company's 2/3 of the work and 2/3 of the budget. The company should still do some of the work and should show it that it has a facility, but that can help you meet the requirements. The other thing that I always like to point out is that you can include in the application a 7% fee. If you don't include it, you can ask for it later. So I do encourage you to include it, for the reason that it's actually the only money that NIH will provide, where we won't restrict in any way or ask you how you are spending it. And that becomes really important because for those of you that have gotten NIH grants, you'll learn that there are things that you need to do as a company, such as pay your lawyers, that don't necessarily fit within an NIH grant. And the fee allows you to be able to pay for some of those things.
Fee for service. CRO-type activities can count as small business costs, providing that it is a commercially available service. All analysis is done by the small business, and it is a fee-per basis, no indirect costs by fee-for-service providers.
Next slide.
Diversity Supplement Program. Administrative supplements to promote diversity in research and development. Small businesses, SBIR, and STTR cooperative agreements, PAR-18-837.
So I mentioned that one of our ideas for a future webinar is to really focus on our diversity supplement program. This is a program that we are able to fund existing awardees to submit a administrative supplement to us if you still have time left in your project, to actually bring in a diverse individual into your company to expand the scope of work for your project. And in that case, we have additional funding available to be able to support that. So that is something I definitely encourage. The first person for you to really talk to, if you're considering that, is to talk to your program officer. And our staff can help answer any general questions as well.
Applications include identification of the candidate as well as a strong development plan. Deadline, applications accepted on a rolling basis.
Next slide.
Technical assistance. Purpose, help small businesses make better technical decisions, solve technical problems, minimize technical risks, and develop and commercialize new products and processes. Request within the application. F. Other direct costs, lines 8 to 10. Label as technical assistance.
So in the application, you also have the ability to, and this is new as well, the ability to ask for funds for technical assistance. It's up to $6,500 in phase 1, but up to $50,000 in phase 2. And it can include any sort of, non-research consultant. So technology expertise, product sales, IP protections, market research and validation, regulatory, manufacturing, reimbursement. So I definitely encourage you to think about that, and you can include that in your budget. And then we are in the process of looking at our technical assistance programs, and we'll hopefully have some additional technical assistance programs to roll out shortly. Next slide.
Already have a phase 2? Consider the Commercialization Readiness Pilot, CRP, program.
So if you already have a phase 2, I did mention the CRP. Now that is for existing phase 2 awardees or recent phase 2 awardees. So you can either do it in parallel or afterwards. It is a mechanism that the mechanism we use, actually the biggest difference between that and a phase 2B is probably that there's no those limits about, so for phase 2 up to 50% of the work can be done by subcontractors. That limit doesn't exist for the CRP because it's really designed to support activities that might make sense to outsource, like regulatory and reimbursement consultants and manufacturing and things like that, where you might not have the expertise and the equipment in-house. Focuses on innovation and really, it focuses on activities that you need to do to commercialize, but those activities in and of itself may not be innovative, but the innovation is really in the product that you're developing. Next slide.
A photo of a smiling elderly woman with short gray hair. Text, scope of the small CRP.
So the small CRP, the solicitation is PAR-19-334. That's up to $300,000. That's only for the consultant side of things. Then the large CRP on the next slide that's up to $3.36 million.
PAR-19-333 and PAR-19-335.
And that can support both the same things in the small CRP, as well as some of the, scientific core studies and activities that you need to do to either commercialize or get to the clinic, move towards commercialization.
Tips for a successful application.
So I'm now going to transition to your application. Next slide.
Tip 1. Start early. Strong proposals take time to develop. Complete the necessary administrative registrations.
I always, say that, because SBIR is non-dilutive, it is in many ways free money, probably as free as you're going to find nowadays. There is, however, one cost to SBIR, and that is time. It is a government program. You really have to spend the time to put together an application that matches, you want the merits of that application to match the merits of your technology, and that does take time and attention. So you do want to start early. And if you haven't applied yet, there are several registrations that you have to do before you can put in that first application.
Electronic submission information, sbir.nih.gov/apply/electronic-submission.
Next slide.
Refine your vision.
So, you want to start with refining your vision. Start informal discussions to clarify that vision. Please seek help from others that have done this, that have written grants before. They'll be able to provide a unique perspective. And to that note, I think it was critical that when we designed today's webinar, we helped you with that by actually having two people that have gotten phase 2s, and actually individuals where the reviewers highlighted the strength of the commercialization plan in those applications. So we've asked them to come give their perspective, but that's something you should always be looking for. And then probably the most critiqued part of an NIH SBIR application is in fact the study design in the approach section. So make sure that you really focus and provide real estate to that approach section, that you identify the strategies to mitigate risk, present alternative approaches. If you don't, you will get critiqued for it. So make sure that you include that in your application. And of course, we are here to answer any questions you have. Next slide.
Tip 3. Build the right team. Select a principal investigator, PI, with the right expertise. Consider other partners to fill gaps.
So building the right team. The team is another key review criteria, but it's usually not the PI that results in any concerns from the reviewers, but rather little pieces of missing expertise. So, a simple example is if you're doing an animal study and you don't have a biostatistician, you'll likely get a concern that you don't have a biostatistician to do the power calculations for those animal studies that can have a very small effect on your overall score. But if you would have maybe just brought in that biostatistician for, depending on the nature of the study, 7 hours, as a consultant over the course of the project, you could have not had that concern at all. So think about it in that way. Think about all the different pieces of expertise that can benefit the project that you're applying for, and fill in those gaps, whether that be through staff, whether that be through collaboration, or whether that be through consultants. Next slide.
Tip 4. Draft a clear application. First half to 2/3, the elevator pitch. Why is it meritorious? Last third to half, the specific aims for the proposed project.
So drafting the application, now this is true for phase 1s, phase 2s, fast tracks, really any NIH SBIR application. One of the key score driving pages is the specific aims page. And the specific aims page really serves as the executive summary, and it's often the page that reviewers will look to first. How I recommend you write that page is that the first half of that page really serve as the elevator pitch. It tells the reviewers and the program staff that out of the thousands of applications we see at the NIH, why is this the one that should get the best score? Why is this the one that we should be most excited to fund? You want to do that in that first half of page of the specific aims page. You'll include the overview of the technology prototype to be developed, the innovation, the unmet need, your value proposition, and competitive advantage, textual highlights of the preliminary data, just in a couple sentences. You'll include that actual data in the research strategy that follows the specific aims page. And then the relevance to whatever institute you think will be the primary institute for that project. And then the last third to half a page can focus on what are the specific aims that you are asking funds for in this project, and key models, assays, and metrics, and performance milestones, but you'll be able to get much more granular in that in the rest of the research strategy. We do welcome people to send this page to us prior to an application, and we will help you. Often it will be Dr. M.D. Kearns, and if not, we can find someone who is available to provide guidance to, and if that fits what we're looking for, any guidance as far as submitting an application. But it really helps us to understand what you're doing first, because that allows us to answer your questions. So we always suggest that before we talk to you, you send us that draft specific aims page. Next.
Draft a clear application, research strategy.
So the research, I mentioned the research strategy. It follows the aims page. For phase 1, it's up to 6 pages. Phase 2, up to 12 pages. Really the meat of your application. And these slides will be sent to everyone as was indicated. And all the links are live and you can click on them. So no need to, be writing this down. You should include the background information, as I mentioned, really provide some real estate to that approach section. Propose a project scope within the budget and time constraints. One of the myths that I hear from a lot of people that are applying for SBIR, they say, well, I'll just apply. I'm not going to go the maximum budget. I'm just going to go for a really low budget because then, if the reviewers and programs see that I'm not asking for that much, then it's easier for them to fund, that I'll have a much better chance of getting funded. That's actually not true. I found that too many times that actually backfires in that what happens is you submit this really good, really intensive project that we can tell is going to cost $300,000, but you ask for $150,000, and then you're going to get a lot of concerns raised about, this is too ambitious, and the investigators are naive about what this really costs. So you want to make sure that your project scope matches your budget. That is the most important thing, other than making sure that your budget is within the actual rules. Preliminary data is not required. However, I will say that because we get so many applications at the NIH these days, it is often needed to be competitive. But it will vary. If you're doing something brand new, a brand new target, no one's done it before, reviewers and staff will often be okay with less data in that case. But if you're doing something where it's a target that a lot of people have tried, then more preliminary data will likely be required to show why what you're doing is actually new and different and likely to succeed. I mentioned describing potential pitfalls and alternative angles of attack and the real estate in the application for the approach. Next slide.
Draft a clear application, other components.
Letters of support. So these are necessary. They are included as part of the application. Necessary from anyone essentially that's getting paid through this project. So if you're proposing a consultant, you need a letter of support from them that says they're going to do what you're saying they're going to do for the cost that you're saying they're going to do with that. So do include those. They are necessary. But what's really most powerful is actually from people that have no tangible benefit from your application. But we'll talk about what that benefit from your technology could be. So things like clinicians and end users that say, this is what's really missing in my practice, and this can make a big difference for the patients that I am trying to help. Investors that can talk about, this is something that we're considering investing in, but it needs more data for us to feel comfortable with investment. And if they hit the milestones in this application, then there is a good chance we would invest. That can really help in an application. The commercialization plan, which is going to be the focus of the rest of my talk, the bio sketches, budgets, detailed description of facilities, and then when applicable, human subjects and vertebrate animal sections.
Tip 5, conduct your own peer review. So
before you submit, read your application as a reviewer. I think we all know if we have 3 colleagues that we think we can ask them to look at our application, we all know who that one person is that is going to be the most critical and really ask all the really hard questions. Make sure you show it to that person as well, because if you don't, or even if you do, what you'll find is that when you send it in for review, you'll get 3 reviewers, and one of the 3 reviewers might be that type of person that will be very critical and have much more questions than the other 2. So the more you can get ahead of your application, the better shape you'll be when you actually submit. And solicit feedback from independent reviewers. Next slide.
Review criteria, significance, approach, innovation, investigator, environment, commercialization.
So here are the review criteria. And what you'll see is that they're the same review criteria for other NIH funding mechanisms on the left, meaning the word and the title of the criterion is the same, but how it's defined is different. So for example, if you're applying for an all-1 at the NIH, significance will be viewed as what are the chances of a landmark publication and landmark discovery? How much knowledge are you adding to the field? But for SBIR, it's going to be how strong is that unmet need and that problem, and that competitive advantage. What is that market pull? So it's still significance, but it's viewed in a very different way. Next slide.
Commercialization plan.
So the commercialization plan, it is required for all phase 2 proposals. Now that would include what we call traditional or competing renewal phase 2 after you've completed the phase 1, a directed phase 2, as well as a fast track, which includes a phase 2, as well as a CRP and a phase 2B. It is a maximum of 12 pages. The instructions are in the SF424 application guide.
Page B-108.
Next slide.
Developing the commercialization plan. SBIR and STTR grants are meant to support research projects on commercially viable products. The commercialization plan should be based on a company's business plan.
So when you develop the commercialization plan, remember that you want to convince the reviewers that the product meets a compelling need, that you know how to commercialize the product. And that's not necessarily that you'll do it in the phase 2, but that you understand what needs to be done. And that you have or will have, when you need it, the required expertise and resources. And I'm going to touch on these items a little bit more as we dig in here. Next slide.
Think about the 5 C's.
So as you go through, and this came from the Harvard Business School, and the National Institute of Drug Abuse actually has a great document on their website about things to think about when you put together a commercialization plan. And this came from that document. Think about the 5 C's: customer needs, company skills, competition, collaborators, and context. And again, I'll be touching on each of these as we go.
Impact on the overall application.
So the commercialization plan contributes primarily to the significance score, although it can really affect all the different criteria. It can also definitely affect the innovation criteria. You want to show that it's the potential to lead to a marketable product that will have a beneficial impact, and that you're changing the relevant paradigm. So if it's going to be something that's going to be clinically used, that this product will change the clinical paradigm. The scoring criteria can change with the funding opportunity, so definitely look at the funding opportunity and we'll have any additional review criteria. You definitely want to talk to program officers about your whole application. You can ask them questions, including about your commercialization plan. But remember, the commercialization plan should augment your research strategy, but does not replace the research strategy or the importance of the strong research strategy.
Commercialization plan can also impact score for the 4 other criteria: innovation, team, approach, environment.
Next slide.
7 components of the commercialization plan.
So per the SF424, it will walk through the 7 components of the commercialization plan. And that's what I'm going to walk through right now. We'll start with the first one: value project, expected outcomes and impact. Next slide.
A woman points to a sticky note on a wall.
So first, the value proposition. Describing the relative value, how you intend to bring it to market. What is the value? What does this product do? And why is that benefit important? That's what your value proposition really is. So what are quantitative ways your product uniquely addresses such a need? How does it fit with the overall business goals? What hurdles will you encounter and how will you address them? Next slide.
Outline the product development plan, including key milestones and a timeline. A Gantt chart breaks down a 10-year product timeline from research to a new drug application and launch.
It's always helpful to include a Gantt chart, and if you can both kind of have that top bar as far as the scale of time and the bottom part to show how you'll fund the different steps of development, that's often helpful as well. And again, the key is not to say, okay, you're going to do all of this in a phase 2 application. But again, as I'll say over and over the commercialization plan, what you want to impress is that you know the things you need to do, and that in due time you will do them. Next slide.
A hand stretches string between pins on board.
So demonstrate an understanding of the development path, exactly what I just said, that you know it needs to take, even if you're not going to do all that within a phase 2, because we understand that, the budget, we do have these budget limits and you can't do everything within the budget limits. And of course, you have to understand what your regulatory pathway is, if there is one, if applicable. Next slide.
Component 2, company. People sitting at a table with laptops listen to a man speaking.
So articulating, so the second section is the company. And again, it's about vision. Articulating what that clear vision for your company is. Again, there's no right or wrong answer. It's not that we only will fund companies with this type of vision. But what we need to see is that you understand what your company is. What are your unique capabilities? Who is the team? And one of the differences between the research strategy and the commercialization plan, the research strategy is focusing on your project at hand. So when you talk about your team in the research strategy, you're talking about the team to conduct those aims that are part of the project you're applying for. But when you talk about your team in a commercialization plan, you're talking about the larger team that will be necessary to bring the product to commercialization beyond the scope of the individual phase 2 you're applying for. And again, you can talk about what that larger team will eventually be if they're not all there yet, but show the understanding that you know what those pieces are that you will need at due time. And be able to explain those corporate objectives. And we'll get into that a little bit further.
Component 3, graphs on a laptop screen.
The third part of the commercialization plan is market, customers, and competition. Focusing on market first, you want to be able to identify what your market is. So first figure out, okay, is the product supplementing something? Is it replacing something? Or is it really new to the field and creating a new market?
Expected benefits vary with product type.
Next slide.
Estimate sales revenue.
So there's two ways of calculating what your market is. You could calculate forward. So in that case, you're estimating the number of patients with a specific diagnostic or treatment need. You're then looking at what segment or subset of that market your product addresses, and that becomes your addressable market. And then based on time, you know that you're not going to access that whole addressable market the first day you go in. So that's where you get into your accessible market. You can estimate price using current cost per year to diagnose or treat patients as a basis. And then your revenue is really your accessible market multiplied by your price. Next slide. So just to put the same example, let's say there's 540,000 knee and 230,000 hip replacements per year. You have a perioperative treatment. You estimate it's going to be $500. You multiply that by the number of surgical replacements that can be used. That's the addressable market. And then you assume in the beginning you might have 10% of that. And then you can figure out, okay, what is that accessible market in the US? And you can talk about the global markets as well. I mean, even though for SBIR we can only fund work that's done in the US, we hope that there will be a impact even beyond the US in terms of the ultimate patients and researchers and scientists that will benefit from your technology. Next slide.
Estimate product sales revenue.
So the other way you do it, I mentioned, you calculate forward or you could calculate backwards. And that's actually looking at the products that are already in the market, what are the sales for those products, how does yours compare, and then use empirical data to make a case for the anticipated price and market penetration. Next slide.
Customers, patients, physicians, payers. 3 elderly women walk with linked arms.
So now to the customer section of this part of the commercialization plan. So first start with, okay, who are the patients? Understanding the disease indication, but you'll usually have to be more granular than that. And a lot of times your drug might not be used for all stages of an individual disease. So make sure you can show that you understand that. And then you can identify, okay, and it may be time dependent, right? You may have an initial stage where okay, initially we're going to address this stage of development, but over time we hope to be able to address multiple stages of development. How many patients have the disease? What are special characteristics? What are the diagnostic and treatment needs?
A group of doctors in lab coats and scrubs walk down a hall.
And then physicians and payers. What specialty diagnose and treat? How do they make the money? So is this going to fit into that business landscape? Is it actually going to change the paradigm? Is it going to be covered by insurance? And that's where you get into reimbursement and things of that nature. Next slide.
Component 3, continued competition.
So what value are the competitors not capturing? So here you're talking about both competitive advantage and value proposition. What are the strengths and weaknesses of the existing products? And it's not just the marketed products, but you know, if there are other technologies, especially if they're ahead of you in development and they're addressing the same thing, you're gonna, if you don't show why yours has the potential to be different and unique and better than theirs, then you're likely gonna get that concern and review and can affect your score. So you wanna get ahead of that. And then IP becomes a part of that as well. Next slide.
Symbols inside a table with 3 rows: our product, current competitors, upcoming competitors, and columns for important benefits V through Z.
So it's really, I think, helpful when you include some sort of chart that, you know, like this, that shows the key benefits and what your product does and how that compares to both current and upcoming competitors to really highlight what the unique value proposition is for your product.
Research tools, primary.
In looking at the competition, there are several primary research tools. You can do customer discovery. For phase 1 companies, we often encourage you to participate in the NIH SBIRISTTR program as an example, where you really focus on customer discovery. You do conversations, but you don't have to go through SBIRISTTR to do customer discovery. You know, so do conversations with patients, one-on-one, look at blogs, customized market research studies for anyone that's participated in the niche before. And we're going to have several other technical business assistance programs, patient and physician panels, research conferences, industry conferences. Next slide, talk about some more of these. Secondary is company press releases, patent databases, market research databases, clinical trial databases, trade journals, scientific and medical literature, disease advocacy groups, all different sources of information to look at competition.
Component 4, intellectual property protection. A man signs a document.
Next, you really want to now get more granular into that intellectual property protection. So we often think about that as patents. It's not always patents. And, you know, if you're doing software or, you know, other types of technologies, it may be more trade secrets or copyrights. But whatever that intellectual property is for your type of technology, make sure you're able to describe that. You know, if you don't have a patent in hand, and a lot of times, especially at the phase 1, you may not, but what you really want to show there is that you have freedom to operate first, and that you have a plan to obtain the IP at the appropriate time. A lot of times that means you'll have at least a provisional application in to ensure that you retain the freedom to operate. And then, you know, kind of related to IP is commercial exclusivity, which can come with, you know, regulatory approvals and things like that. So you can include that as part of that as well. Next slide.
Component 5, finance plan. Include letters of support where appropriate. A phone with a calculator screen open sits next to tax forms.
So the finance plan. This shows how you're going to obtain the other financing that you need to get this project to its next milestones. So you should tie this again to that Gantt chart and what are the key development milestones and how you're going to pay for each one. Be as specific as possible. Letters of support from potential investors really help support this section, so that you can, you know, show that you actually may be able to get those investors to pay. You could talk about additional government grants too, but ideally in most cases, it's very rare that someone's able to commercialize a biomedical technology with just NIH or even federal funding. So you will likely need to access external capital at some point. So you want to be able to show that you know what needs to be done there. You know, in terms of our goals in managing the SBIR program, what we hope to do is we hope to fund you to collect the data you need to get to that next value inflection point, which often includes getting that next set of private financing that you need to commercialize. So think about it in that way. Next slide.
A simple graph with time on the x-axis, cost on the y-axis, and an arrow with 4 points on an upward slope. Discovery, preclinical testing, clinical testing, and commercial launch.
Number 6, the production and the marketing plan. So what are the different things you will need to do to produce, to manufacture, and then to market? It's pretty involved. Make sure that, again, we're not saying you have to do everything. We're not in the phase 2. We're not saying that you need to have all of these things already all figured out, but that you understand what the key areas are and that the types of expertise that you'll need to bring on, and that you understand when is the right time to bring those types of expertise in. Next slide.
Consider and describe resources. A man draws diagrams on a whiteboard.
So when you talk about those resources, you can have in-house talent, academic collaborators, consultants, CROs, strategic partners, and again, letters of support can always help.
Consider the external path, licensing and partnering.
You consider the external path, which is, you in all likelihood, in many of these cases, especially with therapeutics, you may not be the company that actually ends up commercializing. You will license it to a existing pharma biotech company. And there are many ways that you could do that. Sometimes it's, they fully acquire it and they do everything else, and you collect that check and have nothing to do with it anymore. And in most cases, it's not quite that extreme, and there will be some co-development and or some co-promotion and really collaboration along the way. The internal path is really focusing, okay, our company is going to commercialize, market, and sell this product. You often will have higher revenues, and you'll be the ones that commercialize, but your costs will be higher. So it's something to think about. Again, in some types of technologies, this may be more realistic than others, and showing that you have that understanding helps as well. And the need to, outsource activities and recruit commercial talent.
Component 7, revenue stream. A tablet next to graphs on a document.
Finally, the revenue stream. Ultimately, once you commercialize, this is asking, how will you generate revenues if the product is successful? You would include direct sales, contracting revenues, licensing revenues, and joint ventures. It should correlate with other sections of commercialization plan and the other things you need to do to get to a revenue generating point. Next slide.
Remember, focus on product. 2 hexagons, one labeled science under academic grant, and the other labeled product under SBIR and STTR grant. Arrows point in and out to the components, expertise, environment significance, innovation, approach, as well as optional product for science and mandatory science for product, and a double-ended arrow to commercialization from product.
So I want to finish by saying that you want to remember to focus on the product. One of the differences between an all-in-one at the NIH and a SBIR grant, and then in all-in-one, the real central point is the science. In a SBIR, you're really focusing everything around the product, but that the science is underpinning that product development. And then all the other factors are still very relevant. Next slide.
If you weren't funded on the first try, rejection is painful, but feedback provides a roadmap for next steps. A man writes in a journal next to a laptop.
The honest truth, and this is maybe not the best news for you to hear, depending which boat you're in. If you haven't applied yet, you might hope otherwise, but if you have applied, maybe this slide will help. In that the majority of awards that we make are not the first time someone submitted. They're in fact a resubmission. So it's very likely that when you first submit your project, it will go to review, and the reviewers will have several concerns for you to address that can improve your application. Well, there's actually a process at NIH where you can resubmit, address those concerns, do it in a constructive way, and you actually have a much better chance of then getting funded. And really work with your program officer. What I always suggest is once you submit the first time, it tends to try to go to your program officer right away. They often can't tell you anything right away. They don't see the summary statement any quicker than you do. So I would say, wait till you get the summary statement, look at it, digest it, and develop that response to the concerns, and then send it to the program officer. So then the program officer can answer your questions of, does it make sense to resubmit? Can I address these concerns? They really will only know if they see how you think you can address the concern. So do that, and you can have a much more dynamic conversation. Next slide. I think that's it.
Panelist Dan Burnett.
So I'd like to now introduce the first of the two companies that will be presenting today and giving you their perspective. So these are SBIR Phase 2 awardees that will give you their perspective on what's important, what was important to them in submitting a winning commercialization plan and Phase 2 application. Dan, thank you very much for joining.
Thank you very much, Todd, and we're delighted to have Dr. Dan Burnett share his experience. Dr. Burnett?
TheraNova, Gravitas feeding system. Illustrations of the nasogastric feeding tube components, an infant's esophagus, lungs, and stomach, as well as a photo of 3 machine screens with the organs highlighted. Dan joins via webcam.
We'll just give a moment to get his audio. And Dr. Burnett, are you there yet?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Perfect. I was about to go into some Q&A if we couldn't get to, but thank you. Please proceed.
Great, thanks. So the perspective that I give for this portion of the seminar is going to be manyfold. One is as an awardee of grants, one is as a reviewer of grants, and the third is as a venture capital investor. I've been all three. So I can give feedback and insight related to all of them. First, I'm going to go through the technology. That was our most recent award from the NIA. And then I'll talk to you about what I see as the key components of a commercialization plan, particularly those that I see that we put extra energy into, and as a reviewer that I see frequently being having issues with and pitfalls. So first, the explanation of our technology that will be relevant for the example that I give. We have developed something that we call the Gravitas feeding system. And what this technology is it's a feeding tube that is enhanced with sensors, temperature sensors and conductivity sensors that allow you to report where in the GI tract the tube is. This is important as we set forth in our significance in that right now, every year, there are a handful of babies that are fed into their lungs, which is fatal and a horrible thing that happens. Also, when you place the tube, you have to somehow confirm that it's in the right place. Frequently, people do that with X-ray now. So that's also an added cost and radiation to the baby. So by providing a sensorized tube, as long as we don't add too much cost, we felt we could create a situation where you could place the tube at bedside and not have to send the baby down to X-ray. And we got some pig data and some preliminary adult human data to support our grant, and based on that, we're awarded the grant. The research strategy was to confirm placement in preclinical model, and then to confirm it moving on in a baby in the neonatal population in a controlled manner.
Key commercialization plan elements.
So moving into our commercialization plan and what the reviewers found moving. This is, you saw this earlier from Todd. These are the key commercialization plan elements. And on the next slide, you'll see the areas that I feel are frequently, there are stumbling blocks and or they're overlooked. And that's the market, customers, and competition, the finance plan, the production and marketing plan, and the revenue stream. The value of the project, expected outcomes and impact are largely detailed in the research strategy under significance. The company typically is pretty well described by the most applicants, and intellectual property just is what it is. You list that you have patents pending and ideally some awarded patents, but these other 4 areas are the areas where I see some common missteps that I'll talk about.
A table with costs and units for components and internal pumps in the Americas, Europe, and Asia Pacific.
So first is market, customers, and competition. There's a few things that you want to make sure you do here, and you do it well, is you want to make sure that you know the total addressable market and list it out. And here you can see we break it out not just as the total market, but by region, pediatric and adult, and we validate that from the top down and the bottom up, looking at the hospital enteral pumps and the number of tubes per pump. So that nets out to quite a large market for our device. The other thing that I think a lot of people overlook, traditionally medical device development was focused on outcomes, at least in our sector, and I think it's true of most sectors. Outcomes alone will not do it anymore. I hear, I've gotten reviewers giving me feedback, and as a reviewer sitting on a panel, we've given feedback to applicants that it's not believable that the market would tolerate such a high price point. So vetting that and making sure that you have a good, strong rationale for your average selling price in a cost-sensitive environment is critical. So that's one note that I would like you to leave with.
Common pitfall, downplaying the competition. A three-circle Venn diagram containing logos of companies producing feeding tubes, pumps, and/or internal formula.
The second is knowing your competition. They're probably, both as an investor and as a reviewer, when I hear somebody say that there is no competition, I immediately discount everything else that is said. Even the market, even the status quo or doing nothing is competition to what you're doing. That being said, there are frequently much more relevant competitors as well. And if I see that an application that a major competitor is not listed in their commercialization plan, it makes me wonder if they understand the landscape and how best to enter that landscape, because that is going to be a critical factor in determining whether or not the business is ultimately going to be successful. So I think the best commercialization plans that we've written and that I've reviewed were ones that actually acknowledge that there is robust competition, but describe either how they're going to be better than the competition or how the market is large enough for multiple victories and that they will be one of them. So that's that is another key pitfall I see with applications, is the competition.
A partial bridge juts out over water.
Finance plan is probably, in my mind as a reviewer, one of the biggest shortcomings in the bulk of applications, and one where we spend a lot of time bolstering. As Todd said earlier, nobody wants to feel like they're funding a bridge to nowhere. You've got to make it clear and give the reviewers confidence that after you're done with this work in your application, whether it's a phase 1, phase 2, phase 2B, CRP, that there will be, the company will continue, that it's not simply a research project. And a lot of times this entails having a longer term vision for the company and for what the financial needs of the company will be, and how you intend to satisfy those needs, whether it be through additional government grants, private grants, venture capital, crowdfunding, by hook or by crook. The key is that you have a good understanding, first of all, what it will take to build the rest of that bridge, and that you have some insight into how you will build the rest of that bridge. As Todd had mentioned earlier as well, if you can have letters from potential investors or potential private foundations or other high-powered collaborators, that can help quite a bit in assuaging any fears that this truly is going to be a bridge to nowhere with reviewers. So that's another critical piece. Then the production and marketing plan.
Strong plans can demonstrate a sizable early adopter market. A bell curve made up of the segments in shades of blue: enthusiasts, visionaries, pragmatists, conservatives, and skeptics.
So one of the incredibly critical things here as well is to show that you understand the market, and we talked about competition a little bit earlier on, but that you understand the market and how it's segmented out. And it's in the best commercialization plans, there is an early addressable market, even if it's smaller than the rest of the market, than the entire totally addressable market, to show that you have some low-hanging fruit that you can capitalize on and get some rapid market entry and rapid adoption, in my mind, makes for a much stronger commercialization plan. So for the example of Gravitas, here you can see that we talk about, you can see that we talk about the whole market. This is the entire feeding tube market and how we intend to address it. You'll see the skeptics won't be addressed till much later in the later along. The pragmatists and conservatives will need clinical studies and registry guidelines in order to adopt, is what we're thinking. But the enthusiasts and the visionaries, including those that have had recent tube injuries, will be our early adopters. Cardinal and Avanos are the two tubes on the market now that are used. One is a direct visualization. The other is a magnetic tracking system. They're both only in adult populations, but they both give you an indication of where the tube is placed. So we see any account that has adopted those as being an account that cares about tube placement and a very early adopter for our technology, since we're the only one that can be used in neonates. So we made a very strong case that I think remains very strong, that a sixth of the market is incredibly rapidly addressable because they already bought into the requirement for tube tip location in the adult population and have no option for the neonatal population. So demonstrating that sizable early adopter market for us was critical in winning over a lot of the reviewers for our commercialization plan.
An accounting ledger for the years 2019 to 2025. Text, err on the side of conservative estimates to maintain credibility.
And then the last side, the last slide for me is going to be on the revenue stream. Having some sort of credible projections, and everybody understands, particularly the business savvy reviewers understand that these are just projections, that to truly project more than a year out is very difficult, but getting an understanding of what things could be if they went swimmingly, while most people understand that what could be is almost never what is. So, and what you can see here is we detail what we intend, what we expect to be spending, and what it'll take to get there, our revenues and our cash flows out 6 years out, and then making sure that these numbers are realistic, that the operating income, the operating expenses, and the revenue generation over time is realistic is important as well. As you can see from this, looking at the operating income and the ending cash balance, you'll notice that we have, it gives you a decent idea as to how much we will end up needing to raise over time, year on year as well, which makes can also give quite a bit of comfort to the reviewers. It also shows you the total investment that will be needed in order to get it there on the investment line down in the bottom. So this technology will require a substantial amount of investment, but luckily for us, we've had a track record of raising private capital and private funding, which made this a much more credible proposition with respect to not building, as calling back to the other slide, that we're not building a bridge to nowhere. So those are my main suggestions for the commercialization plan, coming from both applicant and reviewer side of things. And if you have any questions, I think we'll have those at the end. Is that right, Kiara?
This is Monique, and yes, that's correct.
Oh, sorry, Monique. Great.
No worries. And thank you, Dr. Burnett. You had many different perspectives to share, so we really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Panelist Valerie Humblet.
Great. And next we have Valerie Humblet. She is the head of research and development at Collagen Medical. Before we move on to Dr. Humblet, I did want to remind folks that if you like what you're hearing here today and you want to make some suggestions for future topics, We encourage you to check the chat link and fill out our feedback form. This is a good chance to be able to do that while you're listening to the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Valerie joins via webcam.
Thank you, Monique.
Collagen Medical LLC. Molecular imaging probes for personalized treatment planning.
So I just want to give a brief introduction of Collagen Medical. So we're a small company based in Boston, Massachusetts, and we develop contrast agent right now mainly for PET and MRI, with the goal to develop those probes for personalized treatment planning. We like to call them the virtual biopsy tool. We have two technology platforms. One targets fibrin, which is a hallmark of blood clotting, and the other targets the collagen type 1, which is found in organ fibrosis. Our current NIA funding is aimed to develop an imaging tool to look at the atrial fibrosis, which it's a major factor in AFib, a condition very often found in roughly 25% of the elderly population and associated with a high morbidity. Next slide.
Key commercialization plan elements.
So I will also touch up a couple of the different points of the commercialization plan and try to give you a couple of examples of what reviewers said about our commercialization plan. Hopefully that will be helpful if it's your first time writing one, or if you already submitted one and maybe need a couple more advice. Next, thank you.
Component 2, Company. Executive Summary. Effective project management.
So company. One thing I like to do when we do the commercialization plan, but I think it's also true for the research plans. It's every now and then, don't be afraid to repeat yourself. And that's so. What I mean by that is for the company section, I like to start with a short executive summary. It should be like your half page pitch, and so you spend the first 2-3 pages describing your product, but just repeat it, because what we found, reviewers are busy. It's not their full-time job, so not everyone that's reviewing your commercial plan will review it at once. They might review it section by section, depending on the time they have. So it's always good, when you go to the next section, just repeat why your company has such an innovative product that they want to bring to the market. Your team show that you have a team that's very effective at project management, that you're not just asking for money and then when you get the money, let's see what we do with it. That you have a plan, that how to de-risk the investment. You want to maybe mention the result you got into your phase 1 SBIR award, or other data that are coming from other funding. Important to know what the FDA approval pathway is for your technology, and show that you have all the key milestones, that you have a plan to deliver those key milestones, that you have the right person in place for those key milestones. And not everybody on your team will be listed on one SBIR project, but you have a list of advisor that you can reach out, going further than this project. Next slide.
Component 3, Market, Customers, and Competition.
Third section, again, the differentiation, very important. What are you bringing that's does not exist or that exists but that you're improving? Where do you fit with the market needs? And no matter how good, innovative your technology is, if there's no need for the market, it's going to be extremely difficult to get additional funding and sales. So make sure that you've done your research and that there's a need for what you want to develop. Also know your consumer. It's, of course, the patient, the doctor, but also maybe it's the hospital administrator. Try to reach out to some of them, present your technology, and get some feedback. Also, think about the payers. They are also, unfortunately, we cannot develop a technology without thinking about who's going to pay for it in the future. The competitive advantage, I think both Todd and Dan were very clear with that. Know who you're competing against and be very honest about it. And a tool that I like to use is to use the NIH reporter, and that will give you a good overview of what are some upcoming technology that can be your competitor. That might be harder to find on company's website, but going to the NIH reporter, we found that was always very useful. Next slide.
Component 5, Finance Plan. Key for the reviewers: pursuing alliances with leaders in the field, initiated business development activities to engage pharmaceutical companies, include letters of support from these potential partners.
The finance plan, so here I just listed a couple of reviewers' comments. So again, we are in the business of developing contrast agents, so I can give you a specific example for each point. So reviewers were very pleased to see that we had contacted leaders in the field to look at, in the future, would they be interested in licensing our technology or acquiring our company? And even if you're very early in your development, it's never too early to start networking and making those connections. And you'll see that people are, quite receptive. Of course, you don't want to call or email them every month, but once you establish some connection, keep people up to date with what you're doing. And you'll see that people usually are willing to, if, of course, you have a good technology, people are very willing to listen to you and give you recommendation letters that are crucial, I think, for your score for your SBIR grant. So we also initiated business development activities with pharmaceutical companies. And one thing we've done is we've entered several material transfer agreements with pharmaceutical companies and offer them our technology and ask them if they wanted to test them in some of their animal models. Those are usually, small studies. For us, it's not a high cost to provide the material to, maybe do a study with 30 rats. But then, it led to a publication, and then more importantly, it led to a relationship with that company. So last thing, the letter of support. Sometimes we, we got bad review because we didn't have enough letter of support. So make sure you have plenty, and as mentioned by the two panelists before, key opinion leaders, finance person, either angel investor, VC, and then pharmaceutical company, medical device company that could potentially be interested in your technology. Next slide.
Component 6, Production and Marketing Plan. Production, initial, cost-effective and low-risk, clinical development needs, ability to synthesize at high volume for commercialization.
So, assuming that, we're all small business, almost for all of us, the production of GMP material to start clinical trial would require a major investment in infrastructure and personnel. And sometimes it's more cost effective and it definitely lower the risk for an initial phase to work with CROs. And that's one thing that also many reviewers have appreciated in our commercialization plan, is that our goal was not to grow the company right away, that we would be as cost efficient as possible, so stay smaller and use those CRO for production of material. So when you develop that plan, make sure that you're aware of what you will need for your clinical development. How will you need to ramp up production to go from phase 1 to phase 3? It's important, will you use the same CRO? Is it, someone that has the capacity to do that, or will you need to reach out to other manufacturers? And again, list them, show that you did your homework. Letter of support from some of them saying that they have the capability to do it is always valuable. And when looking at production, don't forget what you will do once you reach the commercialization point. At that point, it's a high volume, unless you're a very big pharmaceutical company or a medical device company, you probably don't have that in-house. You will have to work with a manufacturer. Again, show that you thought about that, you have options. You don't need to have one name, just, this is the type of business we will work with to produce the amount needed for commercialization. Next slide.
Component 6 continued. Marketing plans.
So I think Dan just touched at the ease of market acceptance. That's the goal. You want to make sure that, of course, it's would be very difficult to have, all the available markets suddenly switch to your technology, but then look how and who you will target to get your foot in the door and establish your technology as a new standard of care. Also, think about how will you distribute? Will you, use what's already established by the current standard of care, or do you plan on developing your own sales force? Or at that point, is it something your company is not interested in, but you have a plan to say, okay, at this inflection point, we'll look for partner to either license or acquire, license our technology or acquire our company. Next slide.
Application resources. Links to small business resources, database of NIH-supported research, and NIH-supported animal model resources.
And that was my last slide. So thank you for inviting me to this panel. Thanks for listening. And if you have a question, I'll be available. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We do have many questions. We'll try to get to as many as we can. So we'll fire away, and any ones we cannot get to, we will try to follow up. And you can also reach us via email directly. That has been shared in chat.
Connect with NIA. nia.nih.gov/SBIR. On Twitter, @NIA_SBIR. Email, niasmallbusiness@mail.nih.gov. Links to upcoming events, funding opportunities, and mailing list sign up.
So one of the first questions that we wanted to go to is understanding, this is for Dr. Haim, what stage should a company be at when applying for a director phase 2? How does one walk the line of not being too advanced versus not looking advanced enough?
Thanks, and please call me Todd. It really depends on the project, and this is where sending us the specific aims page is really important, because then we can answer that specific question for your project. You know, one example I always give is if you're doing a therapeutic, if you have in vivo proof of concept, then we'll often consider that the right stage for a director phase 2, versus if you still, you know, have only cell line data, then a phase 1 that we have a pilot study might be a better bet. But that's, like I said, I mean, that's one kind of oversimplified example, but the reality is that we can provide more guidance on a case-by-case basis.
Thank you. We have some folks who may have been applicants in the past and received a score of 38, for example, and they were told to resubmit and hope for the best, that they can potentially get funded with any leftover budget. Do you have any guidance for companies who are in the situation in terms of waiting that time period, as well as the importance of resubmitting?
Yeah, so it really depends. Again, I mean, I hate to keep saying that on a case-by-case basis, but I would talk to your program officer so you can get a better sense of, you know, the likelihood that your application would be funded at the score that it's at. But generally, I always recommend a resubmission. It also depends on budget cycles. So, like, for example, right now, you know, if you resubmit, there's a good chance that if we are considering your application, there's a good chance that a funding decision might be made before you even get reviewed, in which case you could just withdraw your resubmission. You know, if you do resubmit and you get a worse score, we still do have the option of funding that first application. However, we will often ask you to explain and address the newer concerns so that we understand if there were some new concerns raised, that we understand how that can be addressed. But you know, it doesn't necessarily mean that, oh, okay, well, if you resubmit and, you know, in the unlikely event, because it happens sometimes, but not usually, that you actually get a worse score, that doesn't mean that there's no chance we can still fund your original application. So, you know, usually I'd say default to the resubmit, but we can give you, you know, unless we tell you that the, you know, chances are you will in fact be funded. Dan and Valerie, I'm not sure if you've kind of been in that situation. Anything to say there?
Yes, so we've submitted many SBIR grant applications. We've been fortunate to have to almost 80% of them funded, but a lot of them were funded through resubmission. And what has happened to us also is that we were, you know, at same sort of score, just at the limit of the pay line. And while the resubmission was up for review, another institute picked the first application because they had money left over in their budget. So our application was first sent to NIH SBIR, and NIMIB decided to, because they had leftover budget, to pick it because it was also applicable to what they fund. But definitely talking to the program officer has always been very, very useful. And recently we just got a grant awarded earlier this month that was a little higher than the pay line, but the program officer really liked it. and we had been in contact with him before the submission, so we had to work with him on the submission and the aims. So it's always good to have the program officer involved, as you mentioned, Todd, before the submission. And so we worked with him before Council made his decision to provide even more information so he could defend our project. So we provided with a couple more of support letter from industry, a couple new update on what we have been doing in the company since we submitted that grant.
Thank you, Dr. Humblet. I wanted to note that there were a couple people who asked about the question of the value and how to engage with a program officer. So you've already preempted that question. It does help. So we really do encourage you to reach out. And we've also gotten some questions about how does someone do that? And so I just wanted to flag that we have chatted you the NIA Small Business at mail.nih.gov email address, as well as Dr. M.D. Kern's email address for you to reach out to us directly. So please do take advantage of that opportunity. It really does help to, even if you're just thinking about your project and whether it's a good fit or want some tips, please do reach out before you apply. I have a couple of questions about the diversity supplements. I'll try to collapse a few in the interest of time. The questions relate to the eligibility and who can apply. So for example, can you apply if you have an ongoing SBIR phase 1, or if you're in the midst of a no-cost extension as a phase 2 SBIR?
Great question. So at NIA and at most institutes, we do not fund administrative supplements in no-cost extension periods. So you would have to be in a, it could be in any phase, but you would have to have sufficient time left to complete the supplement in that phase. So because most phase 1s are short and usually a year or less, typically if you want to apply for a diversity supplement in a phase 1, you'd have to apply pretty early in the phase 1. But if you were in a phase 2, which is 2 years in length, then, applying in the middle of the phase 2 might still be okay. So yeah, hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Todd. We have another question that relates to folks who really appreciate the opportunity to learn about how to develop a commercialization plan, but may feel that they still need some professional help, and wanting to know if there are companies that can help support the development of that plan for people who are more academicians and that have not had a lot of business experience.
Yeah, so there are, some of the best resources are local resources. So, depending where you're located, there might be public-private partnerships, economic development organizations, small business development centers that are funded by the SBA called SBDCs, university-based SBIR programs, state-based SBIR kind of programs that will help companies with SBIR applications and put together workshops and things of that nature. So I encourage you to kind of reach out locally. Your university's tech transfer or entrepreneurship or ventures office, whatever it is at your university, would like to know about the local resources, your local bio, your local SBDC, all that. There are obviously companies as well. There are grant writing companies. We, as a government, can endorse any one individual company, but there are definitely lots of companies out there that do help in this regard.
Thank you, Todd. I have a few quick fire questions on what the limits and parameters are for application. So for a fast track research strategy section, can you provide some guidance on the page limits?
Same as a phase 2. So for a research strategy, it's 12 pages.
Thank you. Does the application submission follow the same NIH deadlines?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. What about the page limits for the bio sketches with the new set of forms?
I don't remember if there is a page limit on the bio sketches. Valerie and Dan would probably be more likely to remember that than I would. But it would be in that 44.
It's 4 pages.
There we go.
Thank you. What are the essential attributes of a competitive fast track grant application?
So I can give my perspective. I mean, one of the things that is tough with a fast track is in a fast track, you are setting the milestones and they need to be quantitative. And then what will happen is at the end of the phase 1, we will review your progress report. And if we deem that you've met your milestones, then you could transition to phase 2 without applying for phase 2 again. I think what I've seen from reviewers is that, you know, if the phase 1, if you're really doing a pivotal study, then there's a lot of concerns about, well, it's not just the quantitative data, but the reviewers want to look at it again. And, you know, it's some of those qualitative specifics. And also, you know, the likelihood of success isn't that high, you know, that it wouldn't, you know, you wouldn't want to guarantee a phase 2 pending milestones if you don't think there's even a good chance to reach a milestone. So, you know, I always say for kind of more riskier projects in the phase 1 portion, like a new drug and doing, you know, first time pilot animal study for a new drug, I would suggest a phase 1 in that case. If it's something where, let's say you have some data, but an example is, you know, the solubility is an issue and you're using well-known, you know, formulation techniques to address the solubility, you're going to do that in the phase 1, show that you can get the same efficacy, and then move on to phase 2. Well, now that sounds a little better as a fast track, but that's just my perspective. Dan and Valerie, please feel free to jump in.
Yeah, my perspective as a applicant and as a reviewer is that exactly what you said, Todd. It's doubling the risk almost, because you now have to write a really good phase 1, convince everybody that you can get all that work done, and then if you get that work done, you need to convince them that you also have a great phase 2 that can then be layered on top of it. So I think you need to have a really good conversation with the PO as to whether they think it's going to be a potential success for a phase, for a fast track. The other thing that I would recommend more, if you have, because you need a lot of preliminary data to convince reviewers that your phase 1 is going to work. If you have enough preliminary data, we've been going direct to phase 2s and have had much more success there than in fast tracks. Because fast track, you're literally having to write 2 applications and hoping you get good reviews on both of them.
That makes sense. And I generally will say I don't recommend fast tracks for new companies. If you haven't mastered the NIH SBIR review process and haven't gotten that first award, I think you're better off with the phase 1, because there are more questions that will come about with applying for 2 phases at once.
There's one thing I want to add for the fast track, because we had a couple of them. Very, very important is your gating decision going from phase 1 to phase 2. It has to be something quantitative and very clear, not, oh, that will improve. No, it has to be in, let's say, in this animal model, we will see an improvement of this much percent. Because if you don't have that quantitative gating decision, and you cannot show at the end of your phase 1 that you reach it, it will not be funded. That's almost, you know, it has to be. Usually we put it in bold and in italic in our aims page. We'll have, you know, 1 aim or 2 for phase 1, and then the gating decision very clear, and then the rest of aim for phase 2. But it's a lot of work to put, especially, I agree, if it's your first SBIR, there's a lot of work involved in putting a fast track together. Would give it a good 4 months of work to, you know, because you have to do your commercialization plan plus a long research plan. It's 12 pages, so takes a lot of work. But it's doable. We, if you have the capability to do it, it's great, because then there's no gap of funding in between your phase 1 and your phase 2. Because I think it's usually 90 days or 60 days before the end of phase 1, you submit a progress report to your program officer. And if you already have reached your gating decision, or they see that you're about to reach it because you already have enough data that shows that you will reach it, then automatically your phase 2 will come, funding will come at the end of phase 1. So there's no gap of funding.
Thank you. The next question is relating to how does someone know whether to apply for a direct to phase 2 or a fast track?
Yeah, again, I mean, talking to your program officer is really the best. We can, that's why I say we always ask for that specific page first, because then that helps us, give guidance on which phase we think best fits that specific application.
Thank you. How important is a quote from a fee-for-service contract research organization? Is a letter of support sufficient?
Probably depends on the nature of the letter of support. I mean, if the letter of support has the quote information, then yes. But, if you're saying that a fee-for-service provider will do X for Y dollars, then you'll need some evidence in your application that that's in fact correct. And whether that's the format of a quote or a letter, probably either way is fine, as long as that information's there.
Thank you. I'm going to transition to a few questions on how funds can be used. Can a CRP grant cover IP expenses in terms of filing new patents?
Yeah, great question. So I've been kind of waiting myself for some official guidance on this. My understanding is that like, you can't put IP filing costs by itself, but if you if part of your CRP is to pay a IP consultant for managing your IP and advising on the IP, and as part of that project the IP consultant is filing IP, I think that may be okay. But if you have specific questions, we can always answer them as they come up. But I think in that case it would be okay. And some of this is, if there is a cost within your application that is not okay, if that's only a small percentage of your application, then that's not likely to affect review and or a decision. We can strike that cost and discuss replacing that cost with something else at the time that we select it for award. Now that has to be a small percentage. Typically we say anything 25% or higher is deemed a significant change, and thus would make something different from what was reviewed. So if you, this also answers a question, well, what if by the time I got the score and found out I was going to be funded, I did some of the work or I realized another thing needs to be done. It's the same point, that as long as you're only asking to change 25% of the aims, whether it's you asking or us telling you that something wasn't okay, then that is usually fine. But anything more than 25%, we would usually require a new review and you submit a new application.
Yeah, and one point of view from a reviewer there is, if we do bring up issues of budget during the review panel, we will be told to hold them, saying that they're inappropriate to discuss during the review. So that further supports what Todd was saying before. Nobody in the review panel will say, this is a good deal, it's a small budget. So don't restrict your budget simply feeling like people on the panel are going to say that they feel the budget is a good deal for the NIH, because you may end up in a situation where when it does come to the point where you can review the budget after the initial review is done, they may say that it's not realistic. So.
Thank you. Just to give a quick break for the speakers, I just wanted to note, please do fill out the feedback form, and I also wanted to encourage you to follow us on Twitter. thirdly, we have received several questions and we're grouping them. So if you haven't heard your question asked yet, please know we are working to get to it.
Yeah, and I'll just echo that on the feedback form. You know, as I said, this is the first time that we're doing this, and I'm really thrilled with the participation. But, you know, we really want to make sure that this is something that obviously it's a big investment for us too, that we should be doing in the future. So any specific comments, ideas for the future really help.
Thank you, Todd. Another question on how funds can be used. Can they be used for research infrastructure?
Research infrastructure.
Could be equipment.
Yeah, so yes, depending on kind of the nature of how you're defining research infrastructure, if it's equipment, yeah, that could be part of your budget. Again, it depends on the case by case. I mean, if you're asking for a phase 1 and, you know, $300,000 project, and you try to get a $100,000 piece of equipment, that's probably not going to fly because you won't have that much money to actually do the work on that piece of equipment. However, you know, that piece of equipment was in a $2 million phase 2, then, you know, that would be more palatable. I mean, generally, I'd say capital equipment of that is less likely to be considered as part of a specific award, but smaller equipment is definitely more palatable. There's also indirect rates that can cover, you know, infrastructure that's not really tied to any one particular project or award, but that's why you are entitled to ask for up to 40% indirect rates. And if you have a negotiated rate with NIH, which takes years to negotiate, but if you do that, then it can be above 40%. But that 40% indirect rate can help us pay for that, some of that infrastructure cost as well.
Thank you. I'm going to go through a few quick questions on the review process. So one participant would like to know about the related to phase 2 research strategy review and how the review is supposed to grade that section. What if the review is veer off grading protocol and only focus on phase 1 report? What should a business do in that situation?
I mean, yeah, talk to us. So, you know, obviously sometimes it may not, it just may be the way things were written in the summary statement, and not necessarily that they didn't look at the phase 2 approach. But, you know, again, we can consider each of those kind of, you know, concerns on a case by case basis.
Thank you. Is it required or advantageous to have a university affiliated PI?
It is not required. Is it advantageous? Again, would depend on the project. If it's something where, you know, university type research, the university can do the type of validation study that would be harder to do outside of university, then it can really help. So it really depends on the project and the need for the types of studies that get done by universities. If that's needed in the project, and if there's a non-university way to do it that's just as strong, then that might be considered. But it can often be helpful, I will say that. Dan and Valerie, I'm not sure kind of how you've seen that. And if you always include universities, or if you've had awards that don't include universities, that'd be interesting to know.
Well, we always have a sub-award to a university because we just have a chemistry lab, so we don't have any animal facility, and now we're going to start our first clinical trial. Of course, you know, we need to work with a university, but we always have a sub-award with an academic center in our proposal.
Thank you.
We don't always have a relationship. We typically do, especially if there's going to be a clinical study of any sort. But we've also had proposals that were just preclinical work. It does help having academic collaborations and/or collaborators, academicians or co-Is on your grant, for sure, to increase the credibility of the grant. But it doesn't necessarily have to have a sub-award or anything to that extent.
Perfect.
Thank you. Do applicants have any ability to request certain SMEs, subject matter experts, in the area of study for our review panel?
So if you Google NIH SBIR study sections, you can see the list of SBIR study sections, and there is a form in the application called the PHS assignment request form. So to answer in short, no, you cannot request a specific subject matter expert, but you can see if you look at the panels, you can see the membership in each panel, and if there is a certain panel that has subject matter expertise that you feel is critical, then you can request that panel and justify why you need that subject matter. You're also welcome in your cover letter if you feel like none of the panels have the right subject matter expertise, you can flag it to the SRO that you feel like a proper review needs certain expertise. Now, again, you can't put a certain person. My guess is if you put a certain person, they probably would not include that person because of concerns about, bias and conflict. But if it's a type of expertise that you're not sure is part of the panel, you can definitely highlight that in the cover letter. The cover letter is only seen by the NIH staff, including the SRO that puts together the review panel. It's not seen by the reviewers.
Thank you. The question relates to the scoring criteria that it looks for ADRD applications in the investigator's prior experience. And they want to know if they're not an AD expert, but may be able to bring a disruptive idea from another industry, how do they successfully apply without that prior experience?
Yeah, so I mean, just in general, I always recommend whenever you're doing something like that, you want to bring in that expertise. So you can definitely do that. For example, I've had over the years many, engineering companies that come with great tech and engineering solutions. But I've seen that in order for them to be successful, they want to include in their project the required subject matter expertise, whether it be a collaborator, consultants, things of that nature. So if you're bringing a technology to Alzheimer's disease, and you're doing a preclinical study, then I would include experts in preclinical Alzheimer's drug development, whether that be, collaborators, consultants, things of that nature. I've never been a reviewer though, so I'd be very much interested in Valerie and Dan's comments here as well.
Yeah, I think anything you can do to bring on the expertise that the team is seen as lacking. So I like the idea of having a disruptive technology. As a reviewer, I would very much like that idea, but I'd also want to know that it's grounded in reality. So if you were to get even one really high profile Alzheimer's researcher or a very credible supporter of what you're doing, then that would go a long way towards bolstering your grant application.
Thank you. I know we used some acronyms during the presentation. We got some questions on that, so just want to flag the Commercialization Readiness Pilot Program is something we've been talking about, we have some questions about whether someone can apply for that after phase 2 or after phase 2B.
I think either, as well as during a phase 2.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. How many visuals do you typically include in the commercialization plan?
That's a question for Dan and Valerie.
Yeah, in my portion of the talk, you'll see I had quite a few visuals. I think visuals help a lot to, as you say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So having something that demonstrates the concept of what you're trying to get, the punchy message of that section, I think helps a lot if you can swing it.
Thank you. Apart from the solicitation, where else can we go for information about what should go into a competitive CRP proposal? Are there any examples?
Don't think there are CRP examples. I think that the contents of a proposal wouldn't be that different from a phase 2B, and I can't remember, the NIAID site might have a phase 2B example or even a phase 2. But you know, if there are any questions about the CRP itself, we can answer them. The solicitation and the application guides will have more information about the specific forms as well. But yeah, hopefully, I mean, definitely the FOA for the CRP has a lot of very specific guidance. One of the things that's unique to CRP is that there are some, if you're in an area where regulatory approvals are going to be required, there are some requirements about at least knowing that you've spoken to the FDA before applying for the CRP. So if you're going to be requesting to do, you know, IND studies, they want to know that you've talked to the FDA and made sure that you're doing the studies that the FDA will ultimately accept. So that is unique to the CRP. So just make sure you read the CRP FOAs, and that will give you a lot of that information. Next question.
Yep. The next question is about eligibility. Does SBIR fund public benefit corporations? And I should note that there's a very detailed eligibility listing on the NIA SBIR website. But Todd, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I'm not sure how public benefit corporations is. So it has to, it does not fund not-for-profits, I can tell you that. It has to meet the small business, and we don't set the eligibility, it's set by the Small Business Administration. So in order to be eligible, you have to meet the Small Business Administration's definition of a United States small business.
Thank you. Can the STTR mechanism be used for a joint project between a company and a research lab within HHS or FDA?
So depends, probably not. So it comes down to money cannot, in SBIR, there's some legislation that, you know, it can't be used for money to flow back to the government. So if it's an STTR, you can have, you know, 30% of the money going back to the government. Now, some of it gets defined in what is government. So there are some exceptions here. For example, national labs, you know, technically in these types of definitions are not considered government. So if it is as part of a national lab, that would be okay, including the Frederick National Lab on cancer. So as well as, you know, many of the other national labs that you might be more familiar with. So those would be okay, but other than that, I would say that the likelihood is no. You can have collaborations with government labs if money is not going, if the SBIR money is not going to those academic labs.
Thank you. There's a question about the I-Corps program. It looks like some folks have experience through the NSF program and wanted to know if that's available through NIH.
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a different program at NIH. The two biggest differences are, one, it's at the NIH, instead of being kind of pre-SBIR, it's actually for existing phase 1 awardees. So you would have to get your phase 1 first, and then you apply to participate in the NIH I-Corps program. The second difference is that it is a program designed specifically for phase 1 NIH companies, and thus there's a lot more life science relevant curriculum. So it will include kind of FDA type stuff and things of that nature. So it's a more life science tailored curriculum as well. So I definitely would, even if you've done a NSF I-Corps prior to getting your SBIR, you probably would still get a lot of benefit from the NIH I-Corps program, as well as the C3I program, especially if you're working on a medical device. That's another entrepreneurial training program, a little bit longer and a little bit broader in scope than I-Corps, but includes many of the same components. So if you're on the medical device space, I encourage you to look at both I-Corps and C3I as options.
Thank you. Getting another question or two on acronyms about AD and ADRD. We're speaking about Alzheimer's disease and Alzheimer's disease-related dementias.
Yes, correct. Sorry for my acronym use. You know, when I first came to government as a AAAS fellow, probably the most important thing I've ever been handed is they gave us a binder that was about 100 pages of all the government acronyms. I don't know where I put it, but it would still be very helpful. I don't know why, but once you've been in the government a while, you just get used to acronym after acronym. So yeah, please keep asking if any are unclear.
Thank you. Some feedback about the direct to phase 2 being available to SBIR only and whether there might be consideration for STTR.
I am not aware of that. That would have to be congressionally approved. So the authority comes from Congress. I think that part of the rationale is that STTR is overall a much smaller pool of money. So like for a lot of institutes, you know, they can't fund, especially a lot of the smaller institutes at NIH, they can't fund too many phase 2s. So that's why I do it. But probably most important to note is it really doesn't matter because you can switch between mechanisms. So, oh, sorry, for direct to phase 2, I guess. But, you know, just saying if you have a phase 1 STTR and you can apply for phase 2 as an SBIR, but I guess maybe that doesn't help. But for phase 2 and the direct to phase 2, in SBIR rules, up to 50% can be subcontracted. So if you do it as an SBIR, it still allows you to subcontract up to half the fund. Well, I think it has to be, you know, 50.1, you know, just above 50 has to go to the company. So, you know, 49.999% can go to the academic component.
Thank you. I think this should be an easy question for you. Are small businesses required to file electronically, and do they have to pay for it?
I don't believe, not an easy question. Yes, I think they have to file electronically. I don't believe there are charges. That's probably more of a question for Dan and Valerie. I don't believe so.
No, it's free.
Yeah.
Yes, it's free.
Thought so, but you know, I've never submitted one myself. So.
Yeah, if someone is making you pay, come directly to us.
Yeah, it's a scam.
We have to help you. When calculating the share of the company in the budget in phase 2, the clinical trial is a major expense, and the academic partner is typically going to get half or more of the budget. Is that a problem?
Again, talk to us. There, so, you know, the rules about percentages, we do have flexibility with SBIR. You know, if you're close to the percentage and it's justified, then we're able to approve that. I will say with STTR, that is actually, those percentages are legal requirements. So we do not have any flexibility. You have to meet them exactly. But for SBIR, we do. The other thing I'll say is, again, it comes down to fee for service. Some of that might be possible under fee for service, and that's not count as part of the subcontract. So we can discuss all that on the, you know, when you have questions about your specific budget. You're either on mute or we can't hear you.
Yes, can you hear me? Yes, we can hear you. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Question for Dr. Burnett. Why did you move from venture capital to development, and how do you define the differences in your day-to-day?
Yeah, thanks for asking. The venture capital side of things for me, honestly, the hardest part for me in venture capital was sitting across the table from the entrepreneur. And there are times when what's best for the venture capital firm is not what's best for the entrepreneur. And I found myself feeling much more allied with the entrepreneur than the venture capitalist. So I decided I wanted to build companies rather than invest in them. So when I left venture capital, I learned quite a bit about what it takes to raise venture capital money. At that time, I didn't know much about what it takes to get grant money. My initial grants were much more like marketing puff pieces for a venture capital pitch. So it took a while before I learned to write in a scientific manner and gain credibility with reviewers But once I'd done that, I found that the grant process was very, it's one of the most meritocratic processes in life, in my mind. I think there's very little, you're going to truly be based on the merits of your grant, versus other things in life where who you know and what is sometimes more important than what you know. So that's true in venture capital for sure. Who you know is more important than what you know.
Thank you for sharing that perspective. And I also just wanted to highlight one of the benefits of the program is that it's non-dilutive. So you continue to maintain your IP.
Right, and there's no control issues too. I mean, one of the big problems with venture capital is typical venture firms, institutional venture firms will want a board seat, and sometimes they'll want to take full control with the first, usually definitely by the second financing.
Thank you. What level of funds are available for the administrative supplement? They're speaking about PAR 18837, and does it go through regular review?
Sorry, say that again. You're on mute.
Okay, what level of funding is available through the administrative supplement, and does it go through regular review? One example of that one, they are looking at PAR 18837.
Yeah, I think that's which one is that? But generally administrative supplements are limited to $250,000 direct costs. So that's for the diversity supplement one, same thing. It depends every year on, how much funding we have available. There's often a fluctuation. For the diversity supplements, which is that PAR 18-837, it is a key priority, so we actually reserve money for that program. But for administrative supplements in general, again, talk to your program officer. That is a situation so those are reviewed internally, meaning they don't go through peer review. That is a situation unlike the grants where a lower budget can help you. Because we generally don't have that much money available for administrative supplements. And also for us, it's a fairness question. And if separate from the diversity supplement, but for a regular supplement, if you're applying for an award size like $250,000 direct cost, that often becomes a $350,000 project. That's as big, if not bigger, than a phase one. And for us, there's a fairness question. But if it's that big, it probably should go to review and be its own phase one. So if there is a need for an administrative supplement, there was something unforeseen that needs to be addressed to complete this project, we will consider it. But usually for us to consider it, it's a lower budget than the maximum, and really tailored to what the specific need is, and just enough budget to meet that specific need.
Thank you, Todd. Given some of the COVID shutdowns around the country, the question is, how does that impact the deadlines for NIA?
Yeah, so we just, for the previous deadline, it was April 5th. Applications were allowed to May 1st without any justification in the application due to the COVID situation. The notice, I think it ends in 91, the notice on late applications for NIH due to COVID does allow applications past May 1. However, you would have to include justification for why the COVID impacts prevented you from applying before May 1st. And then the issue, though, to note is that the May 1st date was put in there because at some point the Center for Scientific Review has to form the review committees and make the panels and then send the application. So May 1st was deemed to be about as late as they can wait to figure out which applications they have and make those review committees without delaying the potential funding of all the other applications that did come in on time. So yes, while applications will still be considered with sufficient COVID justification after May 1st, they may not and likely will not be considered for this round. So they'd essentially wait until the next round, which means it would essentially, in all likelihood, be the same as applying for the September 5th date, because they would wait for that round to come in to then be reviewed. I have not heard, there has not been any announcements yet, as far as I know, unless something came out today, which I don't believe it did, as far as any extensions or considerations for the September 5th date. I have not heard that any of that is coming, but there is a web page at the NIH webpage for COVID-related application guidance, and if anything does come, it would be promoted there. Also, this join our mailing list is on this slide is very important. If you join our mailing list and there are notices like that allow extensions, we always send those out to our mailing list, so you would get that directly from us.
Thank you. These two next questions relate to participants wanting to understand what to do given the COVID-related issues that companies are experiencing. Is there flexibility for using indirect funds for direct costs, such as salaries, especially during this COVID crisis? And if not, do you have any suggestions on where companies can go for that help?
Yes, I believe there is. You have the ability to re-budget up to 25% of your costs without needing specific approval from us, because it is considered a grant and you are considered some budget flexibility. So, if you're not talking about a huge amount, then yes, you can re-budget some of that. And, like I said, in really extenuating circumstances, we may have the ability to consider administrative funds to address something that, couldn't get done because of COVID, but the bar becomes a lot higher because we are limited on that funding availability. You can, I do see a question about administrative supplements during the first no-cost extension period. So normally, no, you cannot, we do not allow administrative supplements during no-cost extensions. The one exception to that potentially could be for, we also have a NOC out for COVID supplements, and this is supplements that, take your existing project and add a piece to it where how your existing project can be tailored in a way to immediately address the COVID crisis. In that case, you cannot be funded during a no-cost extension, but you can apply for a supplement right before you get into no-cost extension, and for the COVID supplements, those can carry you through a no-cost extension, but that's a very unique case. Normally, that's not the case.
Thank you. I know this is time check. I just want to make sure, would you all be willing to stay on for an additional 10 minutes?
I can
to get through a few more questions. Okay.
Sure.
Yeah, no problem.
Thank you very much. If someone is rejected on a phase 1 proposal, can they reapply using direct to phase 2?
Good question. So the official answer, I think we're still looking at this language. I think as of right now, it states that you need to, the phase, direct to phase 2, you should be able to show that you've been able to collect some of those proof of concept data using non-SBIR phase 1, non-SBIR funds. But if that's the case, then that's okay. And again, you could still have collected some data with SBIR funds. You just have to show that some of that proof of concept data was not using SBIR funds. But I will say from just an advisory point of view, again, the more money, the bigger the phase you ask for, the harder it is to get. So it's extremely, extremely rare that I've seen a phase 1 not get funded, and then the applicant go and turn it into a fast track and direct to phase 2, and then get a better score. So I would definitely suggest that if you've applied for phase 1, had review of concerns, come back in for phase 1. You can resubmit one time, but then even after that resubmission, you can't resubmit again and address the concerns, but you can submit a new application that doesn't reference the concerns, but of course your application would likely be strengthened by changes you made that address previous concerns, even though you're not saying that you're addressing the concerns because there's a new application. So, you know, that's what I would suggest. But Dan and Valerie, maybe you want to add to that.
Yes, we've never, you know, been in that situation. Either we've done fast track or just phase 1 if, for, you know, completely new project for which we didn't have initial data. So, but that would also, unless you're able to acquire with other funding a lot of preliminary data between the time you had submitted that phase 1 and now want to go to direct to phase 2, that seems like, you know, a difficult path for funding.
Yeah, and I would say the same thing. If you didn't get a good score in a phase 1, I wouldn't consider it a resubmission if you're going to go to a phase 2, because you ideally will have had generated more preliminary data, so it would be a whole new submission. But like Todd said, I don't think there's any chance of you applying for a phase 1, getting a bad score, and then applying for a phase 2 and getting a good score, unless the reviewers had said they have too much preliminary data and they're proposing a clinical study. This should be a phase 2, unless they're directing you in that direction.
Right.
Thank you. Is proposing to evaluate a compound and orphan indication by including a supplemental aim a reasonable approach?
It totally depends on the project and the need or rationale for doing it for that specific project. So that's something when you send us the aims page, we can discuss that.
We got some other questions about resubmissions and not being funded. I would generally encourage everyone to really sit down and talk to the program officer that can help to refine your application and make sure you're addressing some of the issues and concerns that were raised during review. A question about IP and sharing your IP financials and your commercialization plan on these proposals. How do you make sure that it's not exposed to competitors?
Dan and Valerie, why don't you go ahead?
I think it's important to have your IP well secure before submitting your application. You know, that's always has been our main concern. That's really the thing. You know, make sure you have a good, you work with a good IP firm, and you know, lawyers can be expensive, but you find out that most of the big IP firm will have special program for small businesses where they know your budget is limited and you can work with them because they want to establish a relationship with you. They always, you know, want to have new clients. And we found out that they will say, okay, what's your budget? And maybe, you know, let's say you have $5,000 and that's it. And they'll work with you on that. And maybe they'll ask you to do some of the writing for the patent application or things like that to share the cost. But they are most of the time willing to do it, especially if, you know, if you're new and small, at a very competitive cost, because they want to establish that relationship and keep you as a client for the future. So that might thing. Make sure that, you know, you're covered with IP protection between before submitting something.
Thank you. Todd, can someone apply for more than one SBIR if they have a technology or intervention that has more than one indication?
Yes. However, I always suggest to apply for one at a time, not to apply for multiple at the same application date, and that's primarily for two reasons. One being that it's really, as I said, it's really hard to write a competitive application. So when you try to write two at once, by definition, one of them, if not both of them, usually suffer. And two, a lot of times they will end up in the same study section. And, you know, I've seen over the years that, you know, there will be, you know, areas of concern tend to transfer over, and the concerns about lack of focus tend to transfer over between the applications more than strengths. So it's been my experience that companies are better off submitting for one at a time. Once you get one, and then you want to pivot to another area and have a second project, which is good, then, you know, do that once you have that first application funded, and then you apply for a new one.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the last question. If your question did not get answered, then I would encourage you to please email the NIA Small Business at mail.nih.gov that you see on the screen. So the last question is related to whether someone can apply for a phase 2 if they were funded by another institute for phase 1.
Yes, again, talk to your program officer for the phase 1 about what would be the right institute to apply. You can request in your PHS assignment request form which institute. And you can also request dual assignment in which multiple institutes would get assigned. But yeah, just have that conversation with your program officer and they'll advise you through that.
With that, I want to thank all of the participants. We had many who stayed on for the entire time here, and many for most of the time. So I just want to thank you for your time and for you to know that we are here to help you. We do want your feedback, so please fill out that feedback form. I also want to thank Dr. Burnett and Dr. Humblet for your time as well, your perspectives in helping us to help other companies be successful. And Dr. Haim, Todd, thank you for all the wisdom. I know that you are accessible, and so folks, if you still have questions, please do reach out to us. We will try to respond as soon as possible. Any last words, Todd?
No, thank you all. This has been tremendous. I hope you got a lot of value from it. I'm seeing in the comments that you did, and definitely, again, the feedback form will really help us so we know what to do future ones on, so that we know how to help you. So help us help you by filling out those feedback forms. Thank you very much to Valerie and Dan, as well as Monique, Kiara, and Melissa, that whole communications team, and all of our staff at NIA. And thank you very much, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Take care, everyone. Be well.
Thanks, you too. Thanks.
Text, Monique Larock. Melissa Glim.